The Nomiki Show.
Lee McIntyre is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science, I emphasize science, at Boston University. And he's the author of How to Talk to a Science Denier. Lee, thank you so much for joining. This is, I feel like, a topic we should just be discussing every single day, hoping that maybe it just hits one more person or two more people or three more people, because that's how significant this crisis of science denial is at this moment, whether it's pandemic or climate change or, other things that could be coming. So thanks for joining us, Lee. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
So, okay. Our audience knows I've been in Greece, and just a little update for the audience. There are now over 540 fires since we first started talking about the fires, which is a little over 2 weeks ago, where there were over 100 fires in Greece. And the political situation here, which I think relates to many parts of the globe, is you have a center-right government that was dependent on a far-right science-denying faction to go into their coalition to be able to win against what was, in at least Greece, the left government. And this government in particular, the center-right government of Mitsotakis, ran against the last government in how they handled one wildfire. So it's fascinating, because this is obviously our problem in the States, is that we have loose coalitions of many different political factions, but one that happens to be holding us all hostage right now, whether it's denying vaccine science or COVID science or mask science or just science. And of course, climate change. I mean, these fires are not unique to Greece. It's happening in Northern California. And, we know this is, we're on the science side here. Is this about convincing people anymore? I mean, I feel like these are the folks you just can't convince, and they're just keeping us hostage. Does it matter anymore?
I think it always matters to talk to people. And one important thing to realize is that science denial exists on a spectrum. And that, by the way, when you're talking to a science denier, don't use the word denier. I mean, I used it for the title of my book, but no one considers themselves a science denier. Some of them actually can consider themselves skeptics, or, more scientific than the scientists. But it does help to speak to them, because you shouldn't assume going in that they're hardcore and that they can't be converted. And you know what? Even if they were, there are some anecdotal accounts of hardcore climate deniers being converted. And here's the really fascinating thing. When that happens, it always happens in the exact same way, which is that they talk to somebody that they trust. The science denial is not just a crisis of facts, it's a crisis of trust. And so what do the facts matter? What magic words can you say to somebody to convince them if they don't trust you? How do you build trust? Face-to-face conversation, calm, respect, patience, listening. Very hard to pull off, but it can work. It doesn't work in every case, but it can work.
This reminds me of just old school political organizing. When you're doing door to door, you figure out, okay, maybe there's somebody who I can move because they're part of my community, they're part of my church. And this is actually what the right wing has been very effective at doing, is organizing with, within churches. But it could be your neighbor. It could be, this was well known to work with the LGBTQ movement when they were fighting for marriage equality, was, friends and family. You'd find out that someone like a Dick Cheney could be moved because his daughter came out. Why hasn't this tactic has it been utilized with climate, for instance, to its effect? And simultaneously, I say this, it's one thing to reach out to them that way, but the radicalization that's happening online just seems to be happening at a much faster pace. And can you have these two things at the same time?
It is a challenge, right? Because the friends of science have to scale up, because we're trying to catch a moving train here. But the good news is that it is possible. And in fact, you put your finger right on it. The best possible means of convincing somebody is somebody who already trusts you. Somebody where it's very hard with a stranger to try to build trust. But if somebody already trusts you, then you've got a little bit of an open door. And then the thing is, don't exploit the closeness that you have with the person to insult them, to make, to defy that trust. I was just hearing a story the other day about a young woman who was talking to her father about climate change, and he, was just intransigent, just, whatever facts she presented. And then she finally said, "Dad, why do you trust all these people that you've never met, but you don't trust your own daughter?" And that did the trick. So, that was an emotional appeal. It was not a factual appeal. But notice what happened. She went with the trust issue first, and then all of a sudden, all of the factual issues fell into place. If we think that the best way to confront a science denier is just to cram facts down their throat because they don't know them, that's wrong, and it will not work. And in the polarized environment that now exists over, COVID and climate change and other things, it just won't work. What's going to work, if anything will, is building trust, engaging people face to face, and not avoiding difficult conversations.
This reminds me of Drew Weston's work, The Political Brain, who wrote about this maybe a decade ago, about how Bill Clinton, for instance, was so effective at communicating to voters that wouldn't necessarily, specifically it was all voter related, but at the end of the day, it's all the same mechanism as you're trying to sway people. And he would appeal to their emotions or tap into something very personal to connect with them. But that's also how coalitions are built. And if this is a political crisis as much as it's a messaging crisis, as much as it's a science crisis. So just for folks, watching who, all right, we all believe in science. We all want to move people. We all have family members that may not agree with us. And maybe we fought with them online and maybe that's not the right strategy. It maybe does have to be more in person. But what are some of the tricks of the trade that you could share with folks watching right now?
I guess the main thing to say is that in a human face-to-face encounter, listening counts for a lot. And it's hard. It's hard to listen and not interrupt somebody when they're telling you about some giant conspiracy theory that you think, well, I'm going to deplatform this right now, that just by listening that you're, giving it oxygen. That's not the case. Don't let them think that they've convinced you. But the human tendency is that when somebody is, no matter how rabid they are about a topic, they will eventually stop and say, well, what do you think? Have I convinced you? And then that's your opportunity not to say you're a fool or to argue with them, but maybe to ask questions. Because again, the anecdotal accounts that I've read have to do with people asking a question. The young woman I just told you about was somebody who had asked a question. And so one of my very favorite questions that I will use, and I use this on flat earthers, by the way, so this is against hardcore science deniers, is I'll let them present whatever they want to say. And usually it has to do with evidence, the evidence for climate change, the evidence that the CDC is corrupt, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'll ask them this. It seems to me that your beliefs are based on evidence. Is that right? And they'll say yes. And then I'll say, well, if that's true, what evidence could I present to change your mind? What would have to be true to show that you were wrong? They tend not to be able to answer that, or let me put it this way, it makes them think for a moment. And then if they can't answer that question, don't fill the space. Just let them sit with the ability not to answer that question for a moment. And that's an uncomfortable couple of minutes when they realize, wait a minute, if no matter what the evidence is, I'd still believe this. Maybe it's not based on evidence. Maybe it's faith. Maybe it's ideology. Maybe it's politics. I'm just not going to give up my views. Make them a little uncomfortable.
So you mentioned faith, and that was my next question. There's so much identity, and I understand that you say there's a spectrum, which is really important. Yes. Because, we all have family members, of course, I'm sure, and friends through our lives that there doesn't seem like there's much to move them. And it's almost as if their beliefs have become their identities.
Yes.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So it's one thing to challenge somebody about a couple of ideas and maybe they're more flexible and willing to communicate. But then there are folks who their beliefs are their identities. And that could be religious identity. It could be a Trump supporter now. I mean, whatever Trump says, they'll take because it's their identity. It's their community. It's how they feel they belong in a time of crisis. They may have joined because they were seeking at one point, but now it is their lives. So are those people that you can sway at this point? Or are those the ones we say, okay, we can't reach them, but we can reach these other folks?
It's if you can tell in advance, I take my hat off to you because you don't always know. Sometimes people are the hardest core until that moment when they say, well, I guess I was wrong. And that happens, right? So, there's a famous case of a U.S. member of Congress, Jim Bridenstine, who was such a hardcore climate denier that he gave a speech in Congress about, with all these false claims that, climate deniers make. And so, of course, Trump appointed him to be the head of NASA, because what else would you do with a climate denier? Within a month, Bridenstine changed his mind publicly and said he had been wrong. Now, why? I think it's because he said he read a lot. Well, he had read a lot before, but all of a sudden he was supervising all of these NASA scientists who were not the evil other anymore. He knew them on a first name basis. He was their boss. He hung out with them in the halls. He had lunch with them and began to realize that these are pretty trustworthy, dedicated people and could change his mind. So you are absolutely right that when you attack a science denier's beliefs, you are attacking their identity. It's not just what they believe, it's who they are. If you attack a scientist's beliefs, they may be irritated with you, but if you've got the evidence and they're scientists, they're supposed to change their mind. But with a denier, it really, as I said, it's not about evidence in the first place. As you said, it's about identity. So, but is it possible to change someone's identity? Yes. But that tells you the scope of the problem. It's hard, right? In order to change someone's identity, in order to have them give up one of those core beliefs about Trump or vaccines or climate or whatever it is, you have to take the long game. You can't just, tell them they're stupid, give them a few facts and move on. That's just not going to be a productive conversation.
I've personally found when influencing, when trying to bring people into the circle of communicating about science and facts, it helps to sometimes dismantle the provider of the information.
Yes,
they're giving. So, for instance, if they're getting their information from, an easy one, Fox News and Tucker Carlson, immediately, if it's about science, say, oh, it's interesting that, oil companies are the ones backing the show, or also with Tucker Carlson, if he's talking about income inequality, be like, this is somebody who grew up in wealth. As he's making, $60 million a year, are you going to take advantage in these? So sometimes I feel like that helps, but is that really a good tool? Or is that just something that makes me feel better?
If you can challenge the credibility of a denier's source, that is always to the good. The problem is that one of the tropes of science denial is that they rely on fake experts and denigrate real experts. So you're attacking their sources, they'll attack your sources. I had an email exchange with a guy the other day where he made some outrageous claim about COVID. And I said, please provide me your source. And he did. And it came just from where you'd expect. And I said, well, now, turnabout's fair play. I'm going to provide you some sources. And he said, yes, but they can't be academic, scientific, or governmental. I don't trust those. What can you do in a situation like that? So if it's possible for you to undermine somebody's source, that's good. By the way, when you're entering one of these conversations, it's important for you to have reliable information. And the Yale Climate Coalition has got a terrific website where you can go. They've also got a working paper I remember reading about this whole problem of the spectrum. They divided the science deniers up into 7 or 8 different categories. some of which you could persuade and some of which you couldn't. And they sometimes give scripts for what you can do. So that's very good. And there are a couple of other websites that, the work of John Cook, who's a cognitive scientist. He's really done a lot of work on climate change and how to talk to people about it.
Now I think the question is, how do we talk to folks? Because it is much more than, climate change is a policy issue right now. I mean, we need to actually have real politics that shift the way that we handle, and prepare for climate change. But the vaccination's also a policy issue, but there are folks who, no matter how much you try, they're not going to get vaccinated. And it is going to continue to spread, maybe at different rates, maybe in a different, but we're seeing how the variants are affecting with solely the unvaccinated folks who are really, exacerbating this. So this is the crisis of the moment, and but we're not going to be able to convince everybody, surely. So how do we? What's the best tool with the spectrum at this point?
It's shocking, isn't it? And the parallels between climate change and COVID are really overwhelming. I mean, I remember, I study this. And at the time when COVID denial started, I thought, well, now finally, people are going to understand that when it's a global crisis and it can affect our lives, they need to take it seriously. And then I watched in real time as that disintegrated. People won't even take a vaccine to save their own life, let alone, change their oil consumption habits to save the Maldives or, their own country in the future, or even now as Greece is on fire. And I'm speaking to you from Portland, Oregon, where we had the largest fire ever in the history of the state, the bootleg fire. So there are things. Sorry, I lost track there for a second. Rephrase the question.
Just in terms of the spectrum, I mean, it's one thing, you don't have to hit every climate denier to be able to change policy on climate, just enough to be able to influence it.
Yes,
but in the case of a vaccine and a pandemic, you really, most people need to actually do their part. Otherwise, we're just going to be in this forever.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's frustrating because, as I said before, there aren't any magic words that you can say to a vaccine denier, to a COVID denier. And I think you have to use the same methodology that I've been talking about. As people are polarized, I mean, you're seeing terrible stories these days about, there was something in California the other day about a fight, a fist fight in public over COVID vaccines. That's not going to convince anybody. And I mean, tempers are getting hot on both sides. There was a very interesting. Here's something I can offer that's optimistic. There was a focus group done by a GOP, a Republican pollster named Frank Luntz, where he had a focus group of people who, I'm not going to say they were vaccine deniers, but they were skeptical. They didn't want to they hadn't been vaccinated yet. They didn't want to get the COVID vaccine. And he was trying out different messages to see what might work for them. And what I think he stumbled upon was that by listening to what they had to say about their reasons, they ultimately became much more malleable. So he was looking at, the different groups that he had in, politicians, scientists, different people, to speak to them through video message and which one worked and which didn't, trying to measure that. I think the effect was that he was taking them seriously and listening to them. Now, the one message that did break through, that they said broke through, was from a scientist who took his time and said, look, science doesn't know everything. Here's what we do know. And here's why we changed our mind on this. And, here's what the statistics are. And, he approached them in a very human way, not in an authoritative, I'm a scientist, so you better listen to me, but just sharing information. By the end of that focus group, 19 out of 20 of the people had changed their mind and had said that they were more likely to take their COVID vaccines. There is a way to do this, okay? But it requires the right method and the right message and a patient person to do it. And, It's easy to get despondent about it. It's easy to get angry. I get angry, but to show it, and when you're trying to convince someone, it just turns them off.
Oof. Amazing advice. And of course, being in the media, we're taught to fight. So,
well, I'm a philosopher. We've been known to get into some battles as well.
I've heard in the place of philosophy right now. With that being said, I applaud. I can't believe I'm saying this out loud. I applaud Frank Luntz because just by asking people to be part of a focus group, I mean, that alone it became a vehicle to open folks up and make them more amenable, which whether that was his intention or not, it ended up working out. So like, what's that old line? Meet people where they are and then take it from there.
If you ask somebody for their opinion, you flatter them. Yes. And then they're more likely to want to know what your opinion is. It's a when I was at that Flat Earth convention, I was quiet the first day. But then when I started to speak and they knew who I was and, were suspicious as hell, I still would when I entered a conversation, would let them speak first. I mean, what else was I going to do? There were 650 of them. There was one of me. But it always happened in that conversation that after I let them spout off everything that they thought was convincing evidence, and then I still shut up. I didn't just jump in with 10 reasons they were wrong. I just kept quiet. They'd say, "Don't you think I'm right? Doesn't that make sense?" And then I'd say, "Well, I have a few questions." And I didn't convince anybody on the spot, but I did get them to listen to me, and I got them to be curious about what I thought, which if I'd come in there just bowling them over, never would have happened because these were strangers and I was in a hostile environment, and it was a searing experience, but I did it because I wanted to learn how to talk to the hardest core deniers so that I could then go talk to climate deniers.
Exactly. It's so interesting about this. Just as we wrap, I've watched some of these interviews with, and actually on our show, we've interviewed hostage negotiators.
Yes.
Folks who go into, whether it's Syria, as one of our guests and had to find hostages or dealing with radical, cult leaders who've held hostages, or, the more traditional hostage negotiation. Like you said, it's you let them talk, you ask questions, and then you build that trust. And then little by little, you may be able to move them over to your side. And I'm sure lawyers experience that too when they're negotiating. Everybody, it's negotiation, essentially.
Well, lawyers are sometimes a little more hostile, but the hostage negotiator is good. Some literature that I've read on deprogramming people from cults. Ooh. Quite interesting, the tactics that they use. Not bad tactics to use for this purpose as well, because if you think about it, science deniers have been indoctrinated. Right. They didn't come up on their own with the idea that there were microchips in the vaccine. They read that somewhere. And you know what? That lie was created by someone for a purpose.
That's right.
The disinformation is intentionally created because it serves somebody else's purpose, and then it gets out there and gets amplified. And science deniers are victims in many cases because they believe this stuff. And if you remember that, it can help you have some empathy in these conversations with them.
What a great way to have it, to end us. Having a perspective that you come at it as if they're victims. And it's predatory. I mean, it's ultimately that's it. This is somebody who you talk about the man behind the curtain. So many folks think that, yes, and they're preying on you to your own demise.
To a conspiracy-minded person, that might just do it.
Yep. There you go. It's like flip the script. I hate to tell you.
Yeah. Now, I mean, there is some evidence that I have to say it's not a conspiracy theory. There is some evidence that this disinformation is being created by nameable individuals.
Right.
And there aren't that many of them out there to do it. They just get it amplified all over Twitter and social media, and that's it.
Couldn't agree more. We'd love to have you back on. I don't feel like this is going to go away anytime soon, so maybe we can talk about some of those the agendas of some of the folks spreading this misinformation and how it's facilitated, because that's a whole other topic that I'm fascinated by. But we need like an hour for that. So
thank you. I would enjoy that. Thanks very much for having me on your program.
Of course. Thank you so much. Take care.